Selamat pagi rekan-rekan mahasiswa. Hari ini kita akan belajar bersama mempelajari address resolution. Dalam materi ini, Anda akan mempelajari ARP, menjelaskan tujuan dari ARP. Jika jaringan Anda menggunakan protokol komunikasi IPv4, Address Resolution Protocol atau ARP adalah yang Anda butuhkan untuk memetakan alamat IPv4 ke alamat MAC. Setiap perangkat IP di jaringan Ethernet memiliki alamat MAC Ethernet yang unik. Ketika perangkat mengirimkan frame layer 2 Ethernet, ia berisi dua alamat ini. 1. Alamat MAC tujuan. Alamat MAC Ethernet dari perangkat tujuan di segmen jaringan lokal yang sama. Jika host tujuan berada di jaringan lain, maka alamat tujuan dalam frame adalah alamat gateway default, misalnya, router. 2. Alamat MAC sumber. Alamat MAC dari NIC Ethernet pada host sumber. Untuk mengirim paket ke host lain di jaringan IPv4 lokal yang sama, host harus mengetahui alamat IPv4 dan alamat MAC dari perangkat tujuan. Perangkat menggunakan ARP untuk menentukan alamat MAC tujuan dari perangkat lokal ketika mengetahui alamat IPv4-nya. ARP menyediakan dua fungsi dasar yaitu 1. Menyelesaikan alamat IPv4 ke alamat MAC. 2. Memelihara tabel pemetaan alamat IPv4 ke alamat MAC.
In this video, we're going to see PCA send an ARP request for the MAC address of PCC. PCA has an IP packet with the source IP address of itself, 192.168.1.110, and the destination IP address of PCC at 192.168.1.50. So it needs to know what the destination MAC address will be. Because the source and destination IP addresses are on the same network, the destination MAC address will be that of the destination IP address of PCC at 192.168.1.50. So PCA checks its ARP cache for the IP address 192.168.1.50. Because it is not in its ARP cache, it will put the packet on hold and create an ARP request. The ARP request contains the target IPv4 address. This is the IPv4 address which is known by PCA, and the target MAC address which is unknown. This is what PCA is wanting to find out. The ARP request is sent as a broadcast, so everybody on the network will need to examine this Ethernet frame and process the ARP request. So PCA sends it to the switch. Because it is a broadcast, the switch will flood it out all ports except for the port that it came in on. PCB receives the broadcast, so it must process it, and its ARP process examines the ARP request. It compares its own IPv4 address against the target IPv4 address, and notice that they are not the same, so it doesn't need to send an ARP reply. The router R1 also receives this ARP request. Its ARP process examines its own IPv4 address and compares that against the target IPv4 address, and also realizes this is not its IPv4 address, so it does not need to send the ARP reply. By the way, routers will not forward ARP requests out other ports. PCC receives the ARP request, compares its IPv4 address against the target IPv4 address, and notices that it is the intended target of the ARP request, that the target IPv4 address does match its own IPv4 address. So PCC will need to send an ARP reply. In the previous video, we saw an ARP request from PCA looking for the MAC address of PCC. In this video, we will see the ARP reply in response to that ARP request. PCC, when it received the ARP request, examined the target IPv4 address and compared it against its own IPv4 address, and noticed that it was the intended target. So PCC will generate an ARP reply in response to that ARP request. The ARP reply includes its own IPv4 address and its own MAC address. It is sent to PCA. ARP replies are sent as a unicast, so the destination MAC address is that of PCA. PCA receives the ARP reply in response to its previous ARP request. It takes the information, the sender IPv4 address and the sender MAC address, and adds that information to its ARP cache. PCA can now take the packet, the original packet destined for PCC, take that packet off hold, and has the information it needs to send that packet to PCC. So it takes the information from the ARP cache, the MAC address, and adds that to the Ethernet header as the destination MAC address. PCA can now forward this packet in the proper Ethernet frame onto PCC. In this video, PCA has an IP packet, source IP address itself at 192.168.1.110, and destination IP address 10.1.1.10, which is an IP address on a remote network. So the destination MAC address will be that of its default gateway, 192.168.1.1, the router R1 in this case. PCA checks its ARP cache for that IP address, 192.168.1.1, and there's no entry with a MAC address. So it puts the packet on hold and creates an ARP request. The ARP request has the IP address of the router, 192.168.1.1, and the target MAC address is unknown. The destination MAC address of an ARP request is a broadcast. So it will be sent to the switch, and the switch will flood it out all ports except for the incoming port. PCB receives the ARP request, compares its own IPv4 address against the target IPv4 address in the ARP request, and notices it is not a match, so it is not the intended target. PCC receives the ARP request, compares its IPv4 address against the target IPv4 address, and it is not the intended target either. Router R1 receives the ARP request, compares its IPv4 address against the target IPv4 address, and it is indeed a match. It is the target of the ARP request. So router R1 will issue an ARP reply in response. It will include its own MAC address, 000D, along with its IPv4 address. The destination MAC address of the ARP reply is a unicast directed for PCA. So it is a destination MAC address of 000A, so PCA receives the ARP reply. PCA, when it receives the ARP reply in response for its ARP request, sees the target IPv4 address and the target MAC address and adds that to its ARP cache. It now has the information it needs to forward the packet which is on hold. So the destination MAC address is now going to be 000D, that of the router R1, its MAC address. And now PCA can forward the frame onto router R1.
Untuk setiap perangkat, timer cache ARP menghapus entry ARP yang tidak digunakan untuk jangka waktu tertentu. Waktu ini berbeda tergantung pada sistem operasi perangkat. Misalnya, sistem operasi Windows yang lebih baru menyimpan entry tabel ARP antara 15 dan 45 detik. Sebagai frame broadcast, permintaan ARP diterima dan diproses oleh setiap perangkat di jaringan lokal. Dalam beberapa kasus, penggunaan ARP dapat menyebabkan risiko keamanan potensial. Seorang aktor ancaman dapat menggunakan pemalsuan ARP untuk melakukan serangan ARP falsoning. Kesimpulan untuk materi hari ini. ARP adalah protokol yang digunakan untuk mengetahui alamat MAC atau Media Access Control dari sebuah perangkat jaringan berdasarkan alamat IP-nya. Ini penting karena perangkat jaringan berkomunikasi menggunakan alamat MAC, bukan alamat IP. Bagaimana ARP bekerja? 1. Pencarian dalam ARP Table. Ketika sebuah perangkat ingin mengirim paket ke perangkat lain di jaringan yang sama, ia akan memeriksa ARP Table-nya. Jika alamat IP tujuan sudah ada di table, perangkat akan menggunakan alamat MAC yang terkait. 2. Pengiriman ARP Request. Jika alamat IP tujuan tidak ditemukan, perangkat akan mengirimkan broadcast ARP Request. Request ini akan diterima oleh semua perangkat di jaringan. 3. Penerimaan ARP reply. Perangkat dengan alamat IP yang sesuai akan merespon dengan ARP reply yang berisi alamat MAC-nya. 4. Pembaruan ARP table. Perangkat pengirim akan menambahkan entry baru ke ARP table-nya yang berisi alamat IP dan MAC tujuan. Potensi risiko keamanan. ARP spoofing. Serangan ini melibatkan penyusupan alamat MAC palsu ke dalam ARP table perangkat lain. Hal ini dapat menyebabkan lalu lintas jaringan dialihkan ke penyerang yang dapat mengintersep atau memanipulasi data. Untuk meminimalisir risiko keamanan, penting untuk menggunakan perangkat keamanan jaringan yang dapat mendeteksi dan mencegah serangan ARP spoofing. Sekian penjelasan materi hari ini, terima kasih dan jangan lupa like, comment, and subscribe untuk mendapatkan materi terbaru dari kami.